The soft shadows are dry now. Everything's dry. So I can go on putting some of the harder shadows in, which don't need the petals to be wet. Also, I want to put in some of the veining in the middle of the petals, as you can see. And for that, I need a sort of the shadow colour, but with a bit of yellow in it, which I'm just mixing up now, to make a sort of greeny grey colour. And I'll need a rigger, I think, to do that, because it's very fine. A rigger is a long shape, which will help me do fine lines. I'm just getting this one back into shape. Okay, so let's have a go with this. That rigger actually isn't fine enough. I'm going to find a finer one. It's a series of little veins in these petals, and they have to follow the contours of the petal to look convincing and realistic. You don't have to be too careful with it. Do it quite quickly, but it just gives the petals more form. The rigger is very useful for this sort of thing, this fine work. It holds quite, because it's so long, it holds quite a lot of pigment and water. So it's better than just a tiny, tiny brush. Okay, that's that done. Now let's put some of these harder shadows in. Need another brush for this to soften some of the areas. It's one of those things that you get into it the more you do it. So that in a way it's best to start somewhere in the painting that won't matter too much until you get into your stride. So I've put some paint there, and then I blend it out with another brush. It's blending out one end of the mark you've made. I'll go quickly around all the petals. It's a shame it's the wrong time of year for these clematis to be out. But I'm not going to let that stop me painting them because I've got some really clear photo reference, and I know the flower very, very well now. Years and years of growing them and looking after them and painting them. So you don't have to wait until they're out before painting them. Gradually the flower starts coming to life as you do this, as you show the form with these shadows. So I'm going to go over all the petals in this way, putting in the harder shadows. Right, that's the main shadows done on the harder shadows on the petals. I'm just finishing off this area here where the petals turning over away from the viewer, and it needs to be darkened there. So now I'm going to go in for the really hard shadows that are being cast, the cast shadow such as that one and that one. And there, where one petal goes over another. And I need a darker colour, a darker tone for that. I'm just mixing up a bit more shadow colour. And start with this. Here you have to actually make the shape of the shadow. It's a little bit scary doing this, but you have to think about the finished effect and try and keep an eye on the tones. And the tone of these shadows has to be quite very dark, actually. So it looks as though it's too dark at this stage, but in the finished painting it won't be. There again, it is partly a question of experience. That, well, all the more excuse to paint often. To gain the experience. The shadow's sort of broken there, so I'm just wetting that. Blending out a little bit. That's it. There's a big shadow here where the one petal's going over another. Often with these shadows, and I've forgotten this up till now, you can, if you drop some pink into them, sometimes yellow and pink, like this, wet in wet, they actually seem to have more light in the shadow, within the shadow, because shadows do have light within them, even though they're darker than the surroundings. So that all helps with the making the painting look more convincing. So many things to think about when you're doing these paintings. This is quite a little bit harder than I've done it, I think. Here, it's actually casting a shadow. Where the leaf goes up here, it's casting a shadow, which is harder. And now, this is the real fun shadow, which is the shadow that's being cast by the stamens. And now we need to think about this a bit before doing it. I'm going to make sure I've got enough shadow colour mixed up. Ooh. So that's the cobalt blue and the violet with a bit of yellow mixed in. So here we go. Really got to just go for it with this. I start the shadow right up into the stamens. Look at the shape carefully. And the shadow just goes over all the petals. And there's quite a block of dark in here. Really gives a really good effect of sunlight. This sort of cast shadow. Right, I'm going to drop a little bit of the pink in there. There's already yellow underneath in the first wash, and that'll shine through. Okay. I think while that's drying, I'll paint some of these stalks. So I'm going to do that with some raw sienna down first, and then I'm going to mix a brown with some burnt sienna, and ultramarine, because the stalks are quite brown. Perhaps a little bit of pink in there as well. Okay. So I lay in the raw sienna first. Quite a wet mix of raw sienna along the stalks. Do all of them at once. Wherever there's a stalk. Okay, and there's a stalk going up here. And then while that's still wet, I'll get my brown colour, and the light's coming from over here, so it'll be to the right hand side, and drop the darker colour in wet, and it immediately gives the stalks form, a rounded form. I think at this stage too, I'll just, we've been putting shadows in the flower. I can just lay some shadows underneath this flower, and I'm using what colours I've got in the palette to mix up a bluey grey. Can you see that under here? And then if we lay that shadow under here, it immediately brings out the flower against the leaves. The shadow goes over everything, you know, right up next to the petals. I'm going to blend that out with a wet brush. And now that makes more sense, because there were shadows within the flower, and now there's the flower is also casting shadow, all starting to actually make sense. Right, now I'll let that dry.